So the Youth in Transition project examines the migration of young adults from zones of war in the Middle East through a transit experience in Turkey and into eventual resettlement in Canada. The project is really looking at, through the life histories of young people, how they go about navigating the process of transition and the process of resettlement within this specific context in which we're living now, in which a context that's characterized overall by the precarity of young people in the social landscape. And the project is in some ways a response to the crisis, but it really has emerged out of the last 10 years of work that the research team has been doing, both research work and also community-based work and activist work around the question of migration. So our thinking about the project really began a decade ago with the arrest of the so-called Toronto 16 and the proliferation of discourses in Canada around homegrown terrorism and the radicalization of young people. And as adult educators, and part of our work is looking at how people learn through their everyday participation in social life, we started to pay closer attention to the lives of newcomer youth and their relationship to the organizations that are meant to incorporate them into Canadian society and into the national landscape. In order to take up that question, we had to really look at the ways in which young people generally, and specific groups of young people, those who are racialized as non-white, are constructed as a threat to various forms of security, economic security, national security within Canada and more broadly. And that expanded our thinking actually beyond the question of migration, beyond the question of Islamophobia, and into the ways in which youth within the ongoing settler colonial project and also within experiences of anti-Black racism also experiences sort of security and securitization of life in a particular way. The fact that young people are being constructed as threats to society at the same time that they are threatened by the society they live in is a pretty wide-ranging ideological project that encompasses a lot of different populations of young people, but for refugee young people, it has a particular expression which we're trying to understand. Both of those projects really directed our attention to the relation between how young people resettle and integrate themselves into the community in Canada, and what is happening in the region, what's happening with experiences of displacement, dispossession, and experiences of transition. The reality for most of the folks who are migrating out of the Middle East, from Syria, from Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, is that they are experiencing protracted lengths of transit through Turkey, Iraq, other places, where they may spend multiple years waiting to be either resettled as a refugee in a third nation or to be able to return to their home. Most studies of young people, of refugee youth in particular, that we've looked at, there's a sort of a tendency to construct the refugee experience from the standpoint of point of departure and point of arrival, that it has a beginning and it has an end. And really the young people that we have worked with and talked to in the communities that we live and research in have talked extensively about this in-between space, the experience of transit, what they learn in that process and how it impacts their overall experience of resettling in Canada and integrating into workplaces, into educational institutions, and into the community. And so that really is the focus of this research, is that in-between space that young people experience. I think the other aspect of the research that looking at the concept of transit and how it relates to the process of resettlement allows us to do is to ask questions about what kind of crisis and crisis for whom. The fact that what's happening right now is being constructed as a European crisis, that it's not an international crisis, that certain nations, those of whom are taking the bulk actually of displaced people, are not part of that construction of where this crisis is located, and that the people who are fleeing are actively constructed as the threat? These are questions that we have to continue to investigate. And looking at what happens in the experience of transit, what happens in the experience of in-between, allows us to ask questions about how this crisis is experienced from the standpoint of young people who are themselves migrating across many spaces. At the same time, as educators, I think we're really interested in how the learning that happens in that transit process impacts their integration, but we're also interested in how institutions are accessible or not accessible to these young people. And so for that reason, access to post-secondary education has emerged as one of the critical components of this research. There is a problem in Canada about being able to effectively navigate post-secondary institutions from the standpoint of refugee youth. Access to post-secondary education can depend a bit on one's actual status, whether one is still in the process of a claimant as a refugee or if one has been officially sponsored and resettled. But regardless, accessing these institutions, integrating into them, resuming an educational trajectory that may have been interrupted by war is a serious concern and is a tricky landscape to navigate for young people on top of the resettlement process, broadly speaking. So that's really one of the major issues that we're taking up in the research through talking with young people about how they navigate, what they access, who are resources, what are not resources, and what their experiences are in this process.